The first snow arrived without anyone noticing. There had been no grand storm, no fierce wind to announce it, just a few quiet flakes drifting lazily through the cold evening air, settling upon the sandbags and duckboards as gently as feathers. Private Arthur Collins was the first to spot them. He stood on sentry duty with his rifle resting comfortably against the trench wall, watching the white flakes disappear into the darkness beyond no man's land. For the first time in weeks, the rain had stopped. The silence felt almost unfamiliar. No water dripped from the trench roof. No mud splashed beneath hurried boots. Instead, the snowfall softened every sound until even the distant guns seemed far away, rolling like faint thunder beyond the horizon. Arthur drew a slow breath. The cold air smelled clean, fresh, almost sweet. He watched another snowflake land on the sleeve of his greatcoat before melting into a tiny drop of water. By midnight, the trench had begun to change. The battered sandbags wore white caps. The rough timber duckboards disappeared beneath a thin blanket of snow. Even the tangled barbed wire seemed less menacing, sparkling softly beneath the pale moonlight. The battlefield had become strangely beautiful. Behind him, warm light escaped from the entrance of a dugout. "Arthur," came a familiar voice. "Tea's ready." He smiled. Some things never changed. Inside, the dugout felt wonderfully warm compared with the freezing air outside. A little iron stove glowed bright orange in one corner, its heat filling the cramped shelter with the comforting smell of burning coal. Tin mugs rested on a rough wooden table, steam curled lazily towards the ceiling. Corporal Evans carefully poured tea for everyone. "There you are." Arthur accepted the mug with grateful hands. The warmth spread instantly through his fingers. He held it close for a moment before taking a careful sip. Strong, hot, exactly what the evening needed. Beside the stove, someone had hung damp socks from a length of string stretched across the room. Nearby, gloves rested on a wooden crate, slowly drying beside the fire. The little dugout was crowded, but nobody minded. In fact, it felt better that way. Outside was winter. Inside was warmth. Private Henry Moore sat polishing a small brass button that had somehow escaped the mud for months. "No idea why I bother," he laughed quietly. "It'll only get dirty again tomorrow." Corporal Evans looked up from the kettle. "So will we." The dugout filled with gentle laughter. Not loud, not forced, just the quiet kind that comes at the end of a long day. For a while, nobody spoke. The little stove crackled softly. The kettle whispered. Snow tapped lightly against the timber roof. Arthur found himself listening. Every sound seemed slower tonight, calmer, as though winter itself had asked the world to be quiet. Henry reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded a photograph. The edges had become worn after months of being carried everywhere. "My sisters built a snowman last winter." He passed the picture around. Everyone smiled. One by one, the stories began. Someone remembered skating on a frozen pond as a boy. Another spoke about waking before sunrise to help his father clear snow from the farmyard. Arthur remembered sitting beside his mother's fireplace while bread baked in the kitchen. The smell filled every room. Outside the windows, snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Inside, everything was warm. He could almost smell fresh bread now. The memories flowed easily. No one interrupted. Every story seemed to lead naturally into another. The little dugout slowly filled with places far away from France. Village streets, country lanes, stone cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys, Christmas markets glowing beneath lanterns, families gathered around wooden tables. For a little while, the war seemed very far away. The stove gave a cheerful pop. A tiny shower of sparks danced briefly inside its iron door. Arthur leaned back against the timber wall. His blanket rested across his knees. His tea remained pleasantly warm. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, silent flakes. He wondered how much would settle before morning. Perhaps enough to cover every footprint. Perhaps enough to hide the scars left upon the fields. The thought brought him unexpected comfort. Snow had a way of making everything seem peaceful, even broken places, even forgotten ones. Eventually, Corporal Evans opened a small biscuit tin. There were only a handful left. Each man took one without hesitation. No one counted. No one needed to. Simple things tasted better when shared. Arthur slowly nibbled his biscuit while watching the fire. The glowing coals shifted gently. Orange, gold, deep red. The warmth reached every corner of the little shelter. Outside, winter wrapped the trench in quiet white. Inside, the lantern glowed softly above familiar faces. The snow kept falling. The fire kept burning. And for one peaceful evening, beneath layers of frozen earth and weathered timber, the dugout felt less like a trench and more like the safest little cabin in the world. The night slipped by almost unnoticed. The little stove burned steadily, filling the dugout with gentle warmth, while the snow continued to drift down outside. Every so often, someone would add another small piece of coal, and the fire would answer with a soft crackle before settling once more into glowing embers. Arthur found himself awake long after the others had grown quiet. Not because he couldn't sleep, simply because evenings like this felt too peaceful to waste. He wrapped another blanket around his shoulders and watched the lantern sway gently from the timber beam above. Its golden light danced across the rough wooden walls, revealing every knot in the timber and every familiar scratch carved by months of careful hands. Outside, the world had become almost silent. The snow absorbed every sound. Even the distant artillery had faded into little more than a low murmur on the horizon. Arthur stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The cold met him instantly, crisp enough to make every breath visible. He smiled. The trench had disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Every sandbag wore a soft layer of fresh snow. The duckboards were dusted with white, and the muddy pools that had filled the trench only yesterday were hidden beneath a delicate, frozen crust. The tangled barbed wire shimmered under the moonlight, each strand decorated with tiny crystals that sparkled like glass. For a brief moment, the battlefield looked untouched, peaceful, as though the snow had gently tucked the world beneath a warm blanket. Arthur looked upward. The clouds had begun to thin. Between them, a handful of stars peeked through. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen stars. They seemed brighter than he remembered, steadier, as if they had been waiting patiently above the clouds all along. A gentle breeze stirred across the trench, carrying the clean scent of fresh snow. It brushed softly against his coat before disappearing into the darkness. He stood there for several minutes without moving. No rush, no hurry, just the quiet company of winter. Eventually, he climbed back into the dugout, careful not to wake anyone. The warmth welcomed him immediately. The little stove glowed softly, its orange light mixing with the fading lantern until the entire room felt wrapped in a comforting glow. Henry was awake now, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Still snowing?" Arthur shook his head. I think it's finished. Henry smiled. Good. Why good? So we can see what it left behind. The kettle was soon back on the stove. The familiar hiss of heating water filled the dugout. No one needed an alarm clock. The kettle always seemed to know exactly when morning was arriving. One by one, the others stirred. Blankets were folded. Boots were laced. Gloves were warmed beside the stove before being pulled onto cold hands. No one spoke very loudly. There was something about snowy mornings that encouraged quiet voices. As the tea brewed, Corporal Evans reached into his pack. "I've got one last surprise." He carefully unwrapped a small paper parcel. Inside rested a handful of sugar cubes. Real sugar. The men looked at one another in disbelief. "You've been hiding those?" Evans grinned. "Saving them." "For when?" "For a morning exactly like this." Each mug received a single cube. It dissolved slowly into the steaming tea. The sweetness was almost unbelievable. Arthur laughed after his first sip. "I'd forgotten tea could taste like this." "So had I." Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened. Not with sunshine. The clouds remained thick overhead. But the snow reflected what little light there was, making the whole world glow with a soft, silver brightness. The trench seemed transformed. The sharp edges had disappeared beneath smooth, white curves. Footprints crunched gently where the morning sentries walked their rounds. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys farther behind the lines, drifting upward before disappearing into the pale sky. Someone nearby began quietly humming an old folk tune. Nobody joined in. Nobody interrupted. The gentle melody seemed perfectly suited to the peaceful morning. Arthur carried his tea outside once more. The mug warmed his hands while tiny wisps of steam curled into the cold air. He leaned against the trench wall and simply watched. Snow rested upon broken branches. It gathered on abandoned helmets and weathered fence posts. A little robin landed on a nearby sandbag, tilting its head curiously before fluttering away again. Life carried on. Even here. Even now. The thought stayed with him. Winter would pass. Spring would come. The fields would turn green again. Flowers would find their way through the scarred earth. The birds would return. And somewhere beyond the horizon, families would wake to the same snowfall, putting kettles on the stove and opening their front doors to admire the white world outside. It was a comforting thought. One worth holding on to. The last of the tea disappeared from his mug. The warmth lingered. Behind him, laughter drifted softly from the dugout as someone struggled to put on a boot that had stiffened in the cold. Arthur smiled. Home felt far away, yet somehow not quite as far as yesterday. The snow had a curious way of bringing familiar feelings with it. Warm kitchens, thick blankets, crackling fires, fresh bread, slow mornings where there was nowhere else to be. For a little while, those memories were enough. The clouds drifted quietly overhead. The robin sang once more. The little stove continued to glow beneath the earth, waiting for the men to return after their morning duties. Another kettle would boil, another fire would be tended. Another evening would be spent sharing stories in the warm glow of the lantern. For now, though, there was only stillness. Only the soft crunch of snow beneath careful footsteps. Only the comforting warmth of tea in cold hands. Only the quiet promise of another peaceful morning. So let the snow continue to rest upon the world. Let the fire burn low. Let the kettle hum its familiar song. Wrap yourself in the same warmth that filled that little dugout on a cold winter's morning. Listen to the silence. Breathe slowly. Feel the calm that settles with every falling snowflake. And as the fire fades gently into glowing embers and the white landscape grows softer in the early light, close your eyes, rest easy, and drift peacefully into sleep.